Good morning, everyone. Oh, yes. It's not my first time to Mexico, but I still do not speak any Spanish, so please forgive me. I will please speak in English. I was asked to talk about complementary feeding, and allow me to start with Winston Churchill. A good speech should be like a woman's skirt, long enough to cover the subject and short enough to create interest. I will do my best. Okay, I have a question to you. Is there a link between what happens in pregnancy and what happens 50, 60 years later? And I presume your answer will be yes. Is there a link between the birth weight and what happens 50, 60 years later, like when it comes to coronary heart disease? And I presume your answer is yes. Is there a link between microbiota and obesity? And again, I hope your answer will be C. C, okay, C. Okay, and this is because you know all these terms which are very so common now in medical literature, like metabolic programming, which means that nutrition and lifestyle during pregnancy and infancy can affect a range of different bodily functions, and finally have programmed some of the diseases, including these chronic diseases, which I showed you some of the pictures. And you are also aware of microbial programming, which means that microbiota has a tremendous impact what is happening later on. So programming is very popular. But one can ask the question, is programming possible? And again, allow me to quote another famous person, Thomas Huxley. The greatest strategy of science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. And facts in medicine, it's evidence. I really like evidence-based medicine, and many people are working on evidence to see whether programming is possible. One of the projects, and I have the privilege to be part of this project, which is fully funded by the European Union, is the Early Nutrition Project. You probably all know Bert Kolecko, who is coming here to this part of the world quite often. He's the leader of this project. And all of us are working to find out whether early nutrition really has any impact on this. Is this programming, is it possible or not? But without any money, without all this funding from the European Union or any other source, we all know that breast is bad. And this is I really like to quote this from BMJ, British Medical Journal. Formula milk is just a food, whereas breast milk is a complex living nutritional fluid that contains antibodies, enzymes, all hormones, all of which have health benefits. And that's why we are promoting it so much. Exclusive breastfeeding by well-nourished mothers, by 6 mothers, can meet the needs of most healthy infants. But no matter how much we promote, there are mothers who cannot breastfeed, and then we need to give something. I will not cover it. But there's also the time when you need to introduce something new. So when breast milk infant formula is not longer enough to meet the nutritional needs of the infant, complementary food should be added to the diet of the child. I have a question to you, which I am showing you on this slide. Is this a complementary food or not? This is an infant formula. Yes or no? C or no? Some of you are saying C here in the first, some of you are saying no. No matter what is your answer, you will agree with some group of the experts, because experts do not agree as well. WHO experts are saying anything other than breast milk is a complementary food. Within the ESPGHAN, ESPGHAN stands for European Society for Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology and Nutrition, we defined it differently, and according to ESPGHAN Committee Nutrition, complementary food are all solid and liquid food other than breast milk or infant formula. So there are differences, and no matter what was your answer, this was a correct answer. What I would like now to do, is in the context of the definition of ESPGHAN, I would like to tell you what is new when it comes to complementary feeding. I will mainly refer to this position paper developed by the ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition. Please remember that complementary feeding recommendations may vary between countries, but the general rules are very similar. Why do they vary? Because, for example, of the cultural reasons, religion reasons, availability of some of the product. So some differences maybe are possible, but still general rules are very similar. So let me discuss about complementary feeding, and I will try to answer 3 questions. When to start it, what to give, and how to give. Let me start with when to give. So for a timing of introduction of complementary feeding, there are a number of issues that needs to be considered, including nutritional adequacy of exclusive breastfeeding, physiological maturation of renal and gastrointestinal function, and neurodevelopment. And usually all this occurs by the age of 4 to 6 months. And by about 6 months of age, infants are developmentally ready for other foods, and the signs of physiological and development readiness include better head control, ability to sit up and lean forward, ability to let the caregiver know when they are full, which is all very important. I will come back by the end of my talk to this, and ability to pick up food and try to put it into their mouth. So there are certain factors which needs to be met in order to start complementary feeding. On this slide, I am showing what are the current recommendations for the timing of introduction of complementary feeding, and it should not start earlier than the beginning of the 5th month, and later, not later than the beginning of the 7th month. So you can see here there's a number of weeks during which you can start complementary feeding. If the mother wants to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months, there is no problem. She can exclusively breastfeed for 6 months, and there is still time to start introduction complementary feed. So there is no any contraindication. Some infants may need it earlier, some infants may need it later. So a number of weeks within which you should start complementary feeding. And what in many recommendations is very much stressed that continued breastfeeding is recommended alongside complementary feeding. So I discussed when to start, not before 17 weeks, but by 26 weeks, and starting complementary feeding does not mean stopping breastfeeding. Now let me discuss what to introduce. And the first thing which I would like to discuss are iron-rich complementary feeding. Why not too late? Like we should not delay the introduction. One of the major reasons is that after 6 months of age, it becomes increasingly difficult for breastfed infants to meet their nutritional needs from human milk alone. And probably the major gaps is not only, but the major is when it comes to iron. So you have to add to infant feeding something that will bring iron into the diet. And this is why one of the reasons why we could not postpone it too long. It should be introduced by the age after 6 months of age. So, and this is important because infants and young children are at particular risk of iron deficiency because the rapid growth leads to high iron requirements. And of course, some infants may require it earlier, but I showed you there is a number of weeks. You may start slightly earlier, you may start later, but there are certain general rules. On this slide, I summarize iron-rich complementary foods. All infants should receive this iron complementary food, which, for example, in my country, probably in your country, it's very similar. These are usually meat products with and on iron-fortified foods, but it's up to national societies to decide what type of iron-rich foods should be encouraged in their own country, depending on food habits and so on. This is what I mentioned in the beginning, that the recommendations in different countries may differ. It doesn't mean one is bad and one is good. This is because there might be some differences, for example, in food habits. So I discuss iron-rich complementary foods. foods which should be introduced. So this is what to introduce. When we are discussing iron-rich foods, and it's important to mention here cow's milk. I don't know how it is in Mexico, but I know that in many countries, or at least in some setting, subgroup of population, some children are still receiving cow's milk below the age of 12 months. It should not be used. This is a position paper on iron, which was developed by the Espegan Committee on Nutrition, but many national recommendations are very similar. It should not be used as a main drink before 12 months, although small volumes may be added to complementary foods. Why cow's milk should not be used early in life? Because it's low in iron, can displace iron-rich foods, can inhibit iron absorption, and as a main milk source for infants below 6 months of age, can cause gastrointestinal bleeding and increase occult blood loss in stool. For older children, there is a certain amount which is recommended. In Europe, Espegan Committee on Nutrition recommended it should not be more than 500 milliliters. However, in various countries, there are different recommendations. For example, in Canada, it should not be more than 750 milliliters. So it depends on the country. Goat milk poses the same risk for the development of iron deficiency, anemia, and Espegan Committee on Nutrition, also some other societies do not recommend to young children. Now I would like to discuss potentially allergenic foods. There will be a specific talk about this, but let me already start discussing it here. I don't know whether cow's milk allergy or generally food allergy is a big problem. In some countries it is. For many years we already have, when it comes to timing of introduction of allergenic foods to infants, we have that all these recommendations agree that there is no convincing scientific evidence that the avoidance or delayed introduction of potentially allergenic foods beyond 4 to 6 months reduces allergy. All these recommendations were developed based on observational studies, but at the moment we are at the stage that we do have a number of randomized controlled trials which were carried out and which were conducted and finalized, and we also have already some results, and I will discuss only some of them which were published in New England Journal of Medicine. The one is, because I think that they are important for our discussion. One is the LEAP study, and the LEAP study was to evaluate the strategies of peanut consumption and avoidance to determine which strategy is most effective in preventing the development of peanut allergy in infants at high risk for peanut allergy. So the population was a randomized controlled trial, open trial, with intention to treat analysis. It was in infants at high risk for allergy, defined as severe eczema, egg allergy, and both. Why such a subgroup of children was chosen? Because these children are at high risk of develop peanut allergies. That's why they have chosen this subgroup. Intervention was peanut consumption for 5 years. Comparison was peanut avoidance, and primary outcome was peanut allergy at 5 years of age. And if you look at the results, no matter what was a group which was analyzed, there was always significant reduction in the consumption of peanut allergy in the consumption group. And here in skin prick positive negative cohort, the relative risk reduction was by 87%. You can hardly find the study that there was such a huge effect. It's a high risk population, but really amazing result with this early consumption. This is a 12-month period of peanut avoidance was not associated with an increase in the prevalence of peanut allergies. There was a follow-up. I will not go into the detail. So this was a study in high-risk population, peanut allergy. Again, I don't know whether you have in your country peanut allergy. In my country, it's not a huge problem, but the whole concept early versus late introduction is very well shown here. The other study which I would like to show you is the EAT study. This is a general population, so slightly different population, large trial again, randomized, open trial with both intention and per protocol analysis. And children here were breastfed until 3 months of age, and after 3 months they were started all these foods which are presented here, look at the amount after 3 months of age until 5 months of age. The small infants were supposed to consume quite large portions of various foods which are potentially allergenic. And in the control group, breastfeeding was supported, promoted and supported until 6 months of age. And here have a look at the results. If you look at all cohort in the intention to treat analysis, in the early introduction, there was reduction in the risk of allergy to one or more foods, but the difference was not statistically significant. The difference was only statistically significant in per protocol analysis. But please have a look at this per protocol analysis. Only slightly more than 700 children out of almost 1,200 children were able to consume these large amounts of food that the investigators wanted them to consume. But if they followed the protocol exactly as it was designed, then there was reduction by 67%. So, but these are two important messages. If we are able to do it, then we reduce, but we are not able to force infants to eat such a bit. So in real life, it might be very difficult to do it. General population, not a high-risk population. And allergy to peanut, exactly the same. Allergy to eggs, exactly the same. What is important also, we are all promoting breastfeeding. Look at the breastfeeding rates. Early food introduction did not reduce breastfeeding. One comment. This comes from the clinical trial. This is not the normal situation. You don't have investigators calling you every month, and you are able to contact the investigators. So this is not the normal situation. But still, early food introduction did not reduce, of course, not exclusive breastfeeding, but at least partial breastfeeding. What is new? There is meta-analysis of all available randomized controlled trials, not only those two which I showed to you. And please have a look at the results. When you look at egg, which I did not discuss, reduction by 44%. Peanuts, all studies included, reduction by 71%, and cow's milk, reduction by there was no significant difference. How does it translate into recommendation? Again, ESPGHAN developed recommendation and address it. For allergenic foods may be introduced when complementary food is commenced anytime after 4 months. No convincing evidence that the avoidance or delayed introduction of allergenic foods beyond 4 to 6 months reduces allergies. So, like any other complementary foods with the time intervals which I showed you, anytime you want it. Infants at high risk of peanut allergy, those with severe eczema, egg allergy, or both, should have peanut introduced between 4 and 11 months following evaluation by an appropriately trained specialist. Again, I don't know how it is in your country, but in my country, in Poland, like in many European countries, there is no such a high risk of peanut allergy. Peanuts are not eaten by small infants. If we start to introduce peanuts very early, we don't know what will happen. And there's a lot of discussion in Europe what to do in countries, in setting, when there is no peanut allergy. So it really depends on you what it is. If it's like in the United States, there is a high risk, there is a special protocol what to do. And then you have to decide. Now I would like to discuss briefly gluten and of course celiac disease. There are two important studies which were change our way of thinking about gluten introduction. One is again funded Prevent CD study funded by European Union, and our team had the pleasure to contribute to this study, an Italian study. And those two studies changed the way we were thinking about gluten introduction. I will not go into details. Two different ways of gluten introductions, but both studies showed that there was similar risk of celiac disease no matter how gluten was introduced, and breastfeeding had no effect on the risk of celiac disease. So it translated into the recommendations. They were developed by ESPGHAN and they're included in the complementary feeding paper. For breastfeeding and celiac disease, introduction of gluten while the infant is being breastfed cannot be recommended as a means of reducing the risk of developing celiac disease. It has many benefits, but reduction of the risk of celiac disease is not one of them. Time of gluten introduction can be introduced anytime between 4 to 12 months, and the amount of gluten, it took us a lot of time, but eventually we agreed consumption of large amounts of gluten should be discouraged during the first months of life after gluten introduction. But we were not able, based on the available evidence, to say what does it mean large amount and what does it mean small amount. So this is still to be discussed. And finally, I would like very briefly, fruits and vegetables, and the reason is that there is a very recent American Academy of Pediatrics position paper that juices offer no nutritional benefits early in life, so instead of juices, what we should promote is eating of vegetables and fruits in the form which is suitable for infants. Huge change, so it's important for us to know. And finally, I would like to discuss how to introduce, and what is really promoted now is responsive feeding. Parents should be encouraged to respond to their infants' hunger and satiety signals and to avoid feeding to comfort or as a reward. This is one of the most promising obesity prevention interventions for children under 2 years of age, as documented in this systematic review. So parents really should, if the child doesn't want to eat, even if it's written 120 milliliters should be given at this age, and the child wants 115 milliliters, don't force them to, as long as the child grows properly. And finally, very recent paper published in JAMA Pediatrics. What is new? It's about baby-led approach to complementary feeding. The rationale behind it was that it will reduce the risk of obesity, and the conclusion was it's safe and effective, but did not prevent obesity. BMI was exactly the same. But it's safe. If parents want to use it, based on this randomized control trial, you can do it. So in summary, when, not before 17 weeks, but by 26 weeks, what? Iron-rich complementary feeding foods, including meat products and or iron-fortified foods, no cow's milk before 12 months, allergenic foods anytime after 4 months, gluten anytime between 4 and 12 months, no fruit juices before 12 months. How? Responding to the infant's hunger and satiety, baby-led weaning, it's safe but not preventing obesity. I showed you the evidence, I showed you the guidelines, but please look, even if the best evidence guidelines are available, they do not automatically lead to improved health outcomes. Look what is needed before on the part of physician and the patient. Physicians have to be aware, accept it. Guidelines should be applicable. They should be able to behave and act on them, and patients should agree and adhere to. So there is a lot of barriers from awareness to adherence, which we have to keep in mind. And my final comment is, half of what you are taught as medical students will in 10 years have been shown to be wrong. And the trouble is, none of your teachers knows which half. It very much applies to my presentation and probably to any presentations here, and especially to infant feeding and how to feed them and when to start, etc. Thank you very much for your attention.